Let me ask you something that the suits on primetime television will never have the courage to put on their teleprompters. What does it look like when a civilizational power stops asking for permission? Because that is exactly what happened in 2025 and into 2026, and the people who built their entire careers on predicting India's permanent subordination to the great powers are quietly, desperately, hoping you do not connect the dots. While Donald Trump was signing executive orders slapping 26% tariffs on Indian goods, while Wall Street analysts were debating whether India could survive the pressure, while the Beltway foreign policy establishment was drawing up its neat little diagrams of who belongs in whose camp, Narendra Modi was doing something that nobody in that world authorized. He was systematically, patiently, and with the full weight of a 5,000-year-old civilization behind him, rewriting the terms of engagement with Beijing, not by surrendering, not by bowing down, by making India the single most consequential swing state in the history of modern geopolitics. Welcome back. I am your anchor, and this is the channel that refuses the blindfold. Today we are going all the way in on the story that defines 2026. Modi's China gamble. Is India walking into a trap laid by the most sophisticated authoritarian state on earth? Or is India outsmarting Beijing in plain sight, while the world watches and misreads every single move? By the time we are done today, you will never look at the India-China relationship the same way again. Buckle in. This runs deep. To understand where India stands right now, you have to go back to the night everything nearly broke. June 15, 2020, Galwan Valley, the Himalayas. Indian and Chinese soldiers in hand-to-hand combat in near-freezing darkness, fighting with rocks and improvised weapons along a disputed mountain ridge at 14,000 feet. 20 Indian soldiers were killed. It was the deadliest clash between the two armies in 45 years, and the world waited to see how India would respond. What happened next is the part of this story that most analysts still refuse to fully credit. India did not send a diplomatic delegation with carefully worded regrets. India did not issue a statement calling for dialogue while quietly accepting a new border reality. India reached into China's economic nervous system and started pulling wires. Within weeks, India banned 59 Chinese mobile applications. TikTok, gone. WeChat, gone. UC Browser, gone. By the end of that year, the number of banned Chinese apps crossed 220. India simultaneously activated Press Note 3, a regulatory mechanism that required mandatory government approval for every single investment from any country sharing a land border with India. Every rupee of Chinese capital wanting to enter India now had to queue up and wait, sometimes for a year or more, for a government nod that might never come. The financial data tells you exactly how sharp that weapon was. From April 2000 through December 2025, China's total share of FDI inflows into India sat at just 0.32%. $2.51 billion across 25 years of one of the fastest-growing economies on Earth. That is not a market outcome. That is a policy weapon kept locked and loaded for 5 straight years, deployed with the kind of cold precision that should have told every analyst everything they needed to know about how India operates when its soldiers are killed on a mountain ridge. Now here's where it gets really dangerous for the people who read the next chapter of this story as weakness. On March 10, 2026, the Union Cabinet of India, chaired by Narendra Modi, approved a significant revision to those same FDI rules. The mandatory government approval requirement for Chinese investment was partially relaxed. Certain manufacturing investments became eligible for a faster 60-day clearance process. And investments where Chinese ownership stayed below 10% and remained passive, meaning no board seats, no operational control, no governance rights, could proceed through the automatic route without waiting for government permission at all. The headlines across global media were immediate and almost uniformly wrong. Reuters called it a reset. The Financial Times used the word concession. Opposition leaders in India called it a capitulation and demanded explanations. And social media in India spent 48 hours in full outrage mode, asking how Modi could open India's doors to the same country whose soldiers killed Indian Jawans in Galwan and whose military backed Pakistan during Operation Sindoor, just 10 months earlier. Stop the tape. If you have been watching this channel and you want the analysis that the corporate media machine is structurally incapable of giving you because it would require admitting that the story they sold you for 5 years was incomplete, then stand with us right now. Hit subscribe. Join the community of people who refuse to be politically sedated by narrative merchants who confuse a headline with a strategy. The truth about what India did on March 10, 2026 is not a reset and it is not a capitulation. It is the most carefully constructed economic trap one rising power has ever laid for another. But you will never hear that framing on primetime, so stay with us. And do not let them blindfold you anymore. Now, back to the trap, because that is exactly what this is, and the details prove it. Read the actual regulatory text, not the summary, not the op-ed, the text. Government approval is still mandatory for Chinese entities in the overwhelming majority of sectors. The 60-day fast track applies only to specific manufacturing categories. The automatic route for sub-10% passive ownership explicitly excludes any investment that confers control, influence, or governance rights. The sectors where these partial relaxations apply are not random. They are electronics components, capital goods, and solar manufacturing equipment. 3 sectors that share one critical characteristic. They are precisely the sectors where India currently imports the most from China and where Indian domestic industry most desperately needs to build capability. Think about the architecture of that decision. India is not saying to Chinese companies, "Come and own a piece of our future." India is saying, "Come and build the factories that will make us less dependent on you. Come and transfer the manufacturing technology that will eventually allow us to compete with you. Come and train our workers on the production lines that we will own, control, and ultimately use to cut your market share globally." The ownership stays Indian. The jobs stay Indian. The technology transfer goes one direction, from Beijing to New Delhi. And the moment that transfer is complete, or the moment China tests India's sovereignty again, that 60-day fast track becomes a multi-year freeze overnight. That is not dependency. That is conditional access, and it is one of the most powerful forms of leverage a state can hold over a rival. Now let us talk about the position of strength from which India is executing this gambit, because this is what the doomsday crowd consistently refuses to factor in. India is not a nervous emerging market cutting a desperate deal with a stronger neighbor. India surpassed Japan in 2025 to become the world's 4th largest economy, with a nominal GDP of $4.187 trillion. Goldman Sachs projects Indian real GDP growth at 6.9% in 2026 and 6.8% in 2027, above consensus on both numbers. In 2025, India posted 7.7% GDP growth, the highest of any major economy in Asia-Pacific, and it achieved that number while absorbing the full weight of Trump's tariff pressure. Read that again slowly. The country that received some of the most aggressive American tariffs applied to any Asian economy in 2025 responded by posting the best growth numbers in the entire region. That is not a country walking into anyone's trap. That is a country that has become structurally resistant to the kind of external economic shock that would have derailed it a decade ago. And Germany is next. India is on trajectory to become the world's 3rd largest economy by 2028, overtaking Germany, the country that was the industrial engine of Europe for a century. And when that happens, and it will happen, the entire calculus of who sits at which table in the global economic order shifts permanently. Now here is where it gets really dangerous for Beijing's strategic planners. China is not coming to this rapprochement from strength. China is coming to it from a structural economic crisis that its state media works overtime to obscure. The Evergrande collapse was not a contained real estate problem. It was a symptom of a fundamental overcapacity crisis across the Chinese economy. Consumer demand has remained persistently weak. Factory wages in China have fallen dramatically from their peak years. Domestic prices across multiple product categories are declining, a deflationary signal that should terrify any government, because deflation, once it becomes entrenched in consumer psychology, is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. China is manufacturing at scale for a domestic population that is increasingly reluctant to spend. The pressure valve for that overcapacity is foreign markets. And the largest, fastest-growing, most structurally dynamic foreign consumer market within reach of Chinese supply chains is India. 1.4 billion people. A rural consumption boom that is broad-based and internally driven. A middle class expanding at a pace that makes Western market growth look like a rounding error. India's GDP growth is powered primarily by private consumption and government expenditure, which are internal structural engines, not the fragile export dependency that makes China's growth vulnerable to American tariff policy. China needs India's market more urgently than it will ever publicly acknowledge. And India, for the first time in the modern history of this relationship, has the leverage to set the terms of that access. They did not think India would notice that window, but India noticed everything. Now I have to address Operation Sindoor directly, because ignoring it would be intellectually dishonest, and because it is the most emotionally charged piece of this entire strategic picture. In May 2025, India launched precision military strikes against terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan, following the Pahalgam attack. The strikes were swift, targeted, and effective. Pakistan retaliated. The situation escalated to the most dangerous India-Pakistan military confrontation since Kargil. And through the entire crisis, China provided Pakistan with military equipment, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic cover at the United Nations. India's own Deputy Chief of Army Staff publicly named China as an adversary in testimony to Parliament. The Indian military was fighting a proxy conflict with Chinese-supplied weapons on its western front, while simultaneously managing Chinese territorial pressure on its northern border. And 10 months after that crisis ended, Narendra Modi's cabinet signed off on relaxing the FDI rules for Chinese investment. The Congress Party called this a betrayal. Several retired generals called it dangerous naivety, and I understand the emotional force of that argument. But strategy is not conducted in the emotional register. Strategy is conducted in the register of calculated national interest. And the calculation here is one that India's foreign policy establishment has spent years arriving at. India cannot fight a trade war with the United States, manage an active security threat on its western border backed by Chinese military hardware, maintain a posture of complete economic exclusion toward the world's second-largest economy, and simultaneously build the domestic manufacturing base it needs to achieve strategic autonomy. Something has to give. And what India has chosen to give is a narrow, carefully controlled, heavily conditioned window of economic access to Chinese capital in exchange for the technology transfer and manufacturing expertise that accelerates India's own industrial rise. The people calling that a capitulation are looking at one move on the board. Modi is looking at the entire game. Now here is where it gets really dangerous for the analysts predicting a flood of Chinese dominance over Indian industry. Chinese companies considering investment in India are doing so with the full knowledge that those rules can tighten again at any moment. The memory of Press Note 3 and 5 years of near-total exclusion is not abstract for Chinese corporate planners. They know that every rupee they invest in India is invested under a conditional license that Modi's cabinet can revoke without a week's notice. That knowledge changes the entire dynamic of how Chinese investment behaves inside India. It is cautious investment. It is technology-sharing investment because that is what gets approvals. It is not control-seeking investment, because any attempt to build structural ownership or governance influence triggers immediate regulatory response. India has essentially created a one-way valve. Chinese technology and manufacturing expertise can flow in. Chinese ownership and control cannot accumulate. That is an asymmetric arrangement that systematically advantages India in every transaction. Let me bring in the dimension that almost no one in the mainstream media is connecting to this story. India is hosting an AI summit this year. China has confirmed it is sending a delegation led by a vice minister from the Ministry of Science and Technology. The United States has confirmed its business leaders will attend, including Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei, American AI executives and Chinese Science Ministry officials in the same summit room in New Delhi, competing for India's technological partnership. India is not choosing sides in the US-China technology war. India is making both sides cross an ocean to audition for India's favor. That is not the behavior of a country walking into a trap. That is the behavior of a country that has recognized its own centrality and is now monetizing that position with maximum strategic efficiency. Now I want to take you to the civilizational layer of this story, because without it, the tactical moves do not make complete sense. Xi Jinping sent India a Republic Day message in January 2026, describing China and India as the dragon and the elephant dancing together. He used that exact phrase and called for expanded cooperation and people-to-people ties. President Xi is expected to visit India later this year for the BRICS summit, which would be his first visit to India in nearly a decade and one of the most significant bilateral diplomatic moments of 2026. Why does that language and that visit matter beyond the obvious symbolism? Because it tells you something crucial about what Beijing understands about its own strategic position right now. Xi Jinping does not deploy warm imagery toward countries he believes he can simply pressure into submission. He deploys it toward countries he needs to manage carefully, because they have become too consequential to antagonize. The dragon and the elephant dancing together is not a message for India. It is a message for Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo. It is Xi telling the Quad, the G7, and every other architecture built partly around containing China that the wall they thought they were building has a very large gap in it, and that gap is shaped exactly like the Indian subcontinent. The historical parallel here is one I want you to hold on to. After World War II, the United States made a catastrophic strategic miscalculation. Washington assumed that communist solidarity was permanent, that Beijing and Moscow were forever fused into a single ideological bloc. They were wrong. The Sino-Soviet split fractured that assumption completely by the early 1960s, and Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger exploited that fracture in 1972 to execute the most consequential diplomatic opening of the 20th century, pulling China out of the Soviet orbit and reshaping the entire global order. The lesson that moment teaches is permanent and universal. Civilizational interests always defeat ideological alignment over time. India and China have a relationship that predates every modern nation-state on Earth by millennia. Buddhism traveled from India to China. Trade traveled the ancient Silk Road between them. They have competed and they have coexisted, and they have occasionally fought, but they have never been permanently locked into any external power's strategic framework against each other. The Western assumption that India would become a durable, reliable military and economic instrument pointed permanently at Beijing's throat was always built on a fundamental misreading of civilizational depth. Modi has read that depth. His foreign policy reflects it, and the people who built careers on the assumption that India would simply stay in the lane they assigned it are now watching their entire analytical framework dissolve in real time. In February 2026, India's Foreign Secretary and China's Executive Vice Foreign Minister met in New Delhi for a formal strategic dialogue. The joint statement from that meeting described the two nations as development opportunities for each other, rather than threats. That is not diplomatic boilerplate. When two countries that spent 5 years in a state of near-total military and economic hostility officially adopt the language of mutual opportunity in a formal bilateral document, that is a structural signal about the direction of the relationship for the next decade. Now I have to give you the honest risk assessment, because this channel does not do cheerleading. This is where the real danger lives, and if India gets this wrong, the consequences are severe. India's trade deficit with China reached approximately $99 billion in the last fiscal year. Imports from China grew by more than 11%, crossing $113 billion. The primary imports are electrical machinery, organic chemicals, and plastic and polymer articles. These are not luxury goods. These are industrial inputs, the raw material of Indian manufacturing. India's factories run on Chinese components. India's pharmaceutical industry depends on Chinese active pharmaceutical ingredients. India's solar panel installation programs depend on Chinese manufactured modules. That structural dependency is the dragon's sharpest leverage point, and it does not disappear because New Delhi signed a revised FDI policy. India's manufacturing sector as a share of GDP was just 13% in 2024 to 2025. The government's target is 25%. That 12 percentage point gap represents years of work, billions in investment, and an institutional execution challenge of the highest order. Here is the specific scenario that should keep Indian strategic planners awake at night. China uses the new FDI opening not primarily to transfer technology, but to deepen India's component dependency, investing in the upstream supply chain segments that lock Indian manufacturers into sourcing from Chinese-controlled entities. If that happens, India does not get a technology transfer. India gets a more sophisticated version of the same supply chain trap, just with Chinese factories located inside Indian borders instead of across them. Modi's government has clearly anticipated this scenario. The sector restrictions, the ownership caps, the governance exclusions, the passive-only automatic route qualification, all of these are designed to prevent exactly that outcome. But policy design and policy execution are two different things. India's regulatory institutions will be tested by some of the most sophisticated corporate lawyers and investment structures that Chinese state enterprises and private conglomerates can deploy. The pressure to approve deals will be real. The line between beneficial technology transfer and dependency-deepening supply chain capture will be genuinely difficult to police in practice. This is the real gamble. Not the strategic concept, which is sound. The execution risk, which is significant. But here is the broader strategic architecture within which this gamble is being placed. And this is the part that makes it look, on balance, like a calculated bet rather than a desperate one. India has simultaneously been building the most diversified trade and economic partnership portfolio of any emerging market in the world. The trade agreement with the United Kingdom finalized in 2025, the agreement with Oman, negotiations with New Zealand, the EU-India free trade deal signed in January 2026, one of the most significant trade agreements India has ever concluded, the ongoing U.S. trade deal negotiations aimed at reducing tariff pressure from Washington. India's export base is being distributed across the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Gulf, and now more deeply into China itself. India's exports to China rose 37% in the first 9 months of the fiscal year ending March 2026. China has become India's largest goods trading partner by total bilateral volume, but it is now one partner among many rather than a dominant dependency. That is the architecture of strategic autonomy in practice. No single relationship is allowed to become so dominant that it creates irreversible leverage over India's choices. Every partner is cultivated. Every deal is conditioned. Every access is provisional. And the whole system is designed to ensure that India always has room to maneuver, always has alternatives, and never finds itself in a position where a single foreign capital can dictate terms. The United States chose tariff aggression and pushed India toward China. China is choosing economic engagement and will find that the terms India offers are far more limiting than Beijing initially calculated. Russia remains India's energy and defense supplier but cannot substitute for Western technology or Asian manufacturing expertise. The European Union signed a free trade agreement and will soon discover that India drives a hard bargain on services, data, and digital trade. Every major power in the system is discovering the same thing at roughly the same time. India is not a piece on their board. India is running its own board. History offers 3 clean precedents for what India is attempting with the China engagement specifically. Japan, after 1945, absorbed American capital and technology under occupation conditions, wrapped it in Japanese ownership and management structures, and built the Toyota, Sony, and Honda global empires. South Korea in the 1970s did the same with Japanese and American investment, producing Samsung, Hyundai, and LG. China itself, most relevantly and most instructively, spent 20 years from 1990 to 2010 absorbing Western manufacturing investment through joint venture requirements, technology transfer mandates, and ownership restrictions that Western companies accepted because the Chinese market was too large to ignore. Then China used that absorbed technology to build Huawei, BYD, CATL, and DJI. The student did not just learn from the teacher. The student industrially decapitated the teacher in category after category. India has watched that entire process from ringside. India knows exactly how the playbook works. And India is now running it back at the country that perfected it, using China's own manufacturing investment to build the industrial base that will eventually compete with China across every sector that matters in the 21st century economy. The dragon taught the elephant an expensive lesson in Galwan in 2020. The elephant has not forgotten a single detail of that lesson. And in 2026, the elephant is back at the table, not out of naivety, not out of weakness, not out of any strategic confusion about who China is or what China wants, but with the cold clarity of a civilization that has decided the most effective response to a rival's aggression is to make that rival pay for the privilege of helping you surpass them. Is India walking into a trap? The question itself has it backwards. India has constructed the conditions under which Beijing's economic pressure becomes India's industrial fuel, under which China's need for India's market becomes India's permanent leverage, and under which every Chinese rupee entering India accelerates the rise of the very competitor China fears most. Beijing is not trapping India. Beijing is walking into India. And that is the story the global media establishment cannot bring itself to tell you, because telling it honestly would require admitting that the country they spent 3 decades treating as a developing world footnote is now the most consequential strategic actor in the global system, that the civilization they assumed would always need Western sponsorship to navigate great power competition is navigating it with a sophistication that puts Washington's current foreign policy to global humiliation-level shame. We tell that story here, every single time, without apology and without the blindfold. Now the floor is yours. I want to know what you actually think. Is Modi executing the most sophisticated economic countermove in modern Asian geopolitical history? Or is India about to discover that the dragon is better at this game than anyone anticipated, and that the trap was always designed to look like an opportunity? Is the execution risk manageable, or is Indian regulatory capacity genuinely not up to the challenge of policing Chinese investment at the level this strategy requires? Drop it in the comments right now. This community does not do groupthink, and it does not do silence. Make the argument. Challenge the analysis. Show your work.